The image of an Egyptian pharaoh has become so ingrained in our culture that it's hard to think of a time when these ancient rulers weren't already part of our collective consciousness. And whether they were good or bad, there's no denying that Egypt's pharaohs had a profound effect on the course of history. But one thing that has endured through time alongside the pharaohs' legacy are the stories of their curses. Whether you believe in curses or not, you can't deny that there's something fascinating about the idea that someone who died thousands of years ago could hold a grudge powerful enough to cross the boundaries of time and impact those around them. So here are just a few of the most infamous examples of Pharaoh's curses, along with some surprising ways that these stories have played out over the years. The mummy's curse, the Egyptian practice of preserving bodies for the afterlife, led to what we now call mummies, but this was actually quite different from how we imagine it today. Unlike modern mummies, the original Egyptian mummies weren't wrapped in bandages, but instead they were covered in resin and then dried in the sun, which would eventually lead to a shriveled, dry corpse. Eventually, the process became more sophisticated, but the core concept remained the same. This practice led to a pretty natural assumption that the body wasn't truly dead. After all, if you cut off someone's head, they might run away, but they wouldn't be able to do that if they were dead. This belief eventually spread to the idea that it was possible to curse someone by cursing their mummy, since a curse is essentially an expression of animosity. It only makes sense that people would want to curse the mummies of their enemies, especially considering that they believed that the mummies could hear them. This curse was believed to be so powerful that even disturbing a mummy's tomb could result in being cursed. And because of this, many tombs were left untouched for centuries. When people finally started returning to these tombs, though, it seemed like the rumors were true. Workers reported finding mysterious scratches on their skin, while others reported hearing strange voices in the night. As time went on, people became more brazen in their desire to plunder the tombs for treasure, and the supposed curses only got more intense. One of the most famous stories comes from 1826, when a man named Giovanni Battista Belzoni explored the tomb of the priest of Amenhotep. While exploring, he found a small statue of a jackal holding a flower in its mouth. Thinking it was cursed, he decided to leave it behind, but soon after, his lamp fell and smashed his eye socket. He soon became blind and died within a few hours. This cemented the idea that stealing from Egyptian tombs would bring bad luck. However, in 1954, someone decided to test the curse for themselves. Archaeologist Howard Carter was the man responsible for discovering King Tut's tomb, but when he opened it, he didn't find any curses. Instead, he found adventure. With King Tut's tomb still relatively fresh, he allowed a group of American businessmen into his tomb, which resulted in one of the men taking a small bust of a baboon deity. Shortly after, he experienced terrible headaches and died. Carter survived until 1939, leading people to believe that the curse had waited for him to die of old age before claiming his life. Pharaoh's curse. One thing that most people don't realize about ancient Egyptian culture is that it was very different from how we view death today. For most of human history, death wasn't seen as something negative. In fact, death was often celebrated as a necessary step towards the afterlife, where the individual would be reunited with their family members who had passed on before them. Because of this, ancient Egyptians weren't afraid to interact with the dead. They would routinely visit their friends and family members in the afterlife, and they were confident that they would be greeted warmly. But the rise of Christianity changed everything. Now, people began to see death as something that needed to be avoided at all costs, and rather than traveling to meet with the dead, they were instead seen as angry spirits who wanted nothing more than to drag the living down with them into the grave. Some even came to believe that the Egyptian pharaohs could use their powers to harm those who disturbed their tombs. In fact, some pharaohs issued direct warnings to anyone who dared disturb their eternal resting place. Perhaps the most famous warning comes from the tomb of Tutankhamun, whose tomb was discovered in 1922. When Carter opened the tomb, he found a small statue of the goddess of wisdom with its fingers crossed. Many believed that this was a sign of a curse, and it only got worse when a series of deaths started happening near the tomb. Within 2 years, 5 people had died under mysterious circumstances, and everyone started believing that the pharaoh's curse was to blame. Now, most of the deaths were people connected to the discovery of the tomb, but there was one outlier, a man named Arthur C. Mace. Mace was a friend of Carter's who hadn't even been near the tomb in months when he suddenly became ill and died. While many saw this as proof that the curse was real, it may have had more to do with the fact that Mace stole a small scarab amulet from the tomb. Although the curse may not be real, stealing from a burial site is never a good idea. Ramses the Pigeon Man. Ramses the Pigeon Man isn't technically a pharaoh, but he was important enough that he had a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, so we're going to count him anyway. Ramses the Pigeon Man lived during the 10th century BC, and he worked as an official for the Egyptian government. But he became famous for his peculiar habit of releasing domesticated pigeons whenever he visited a temple. After his death, he was deified and worshipped by local peasants, although he never became an official god. But because of his habit of releasing doves, he was given the title of the Pigeon Man. And when he was mummified, his remains were stuffed into a pigeon statue and placed in his tomb. Over the next several centuries, people came to believe that the statue was haunted by the ghost of Ramses the Pigeon Man. They believed that he could possess people and use them to terrorize nearby villages. And if that wasn't bad enough, he also had a habit of killing anyone who entered his tomb. But the story doesn't end there. People even reported seeing strange lights coming from his tomb, which many believed were the souls of the people he had killed. To make matters worse, it was rumored that the only way to avoid his curse was to sacrifice a pigeon. But if you sacrificed the wrong pigeon, you would be cursed even worse. Of course, none of this would have been much of a problem if people hadn't started robbing his tomb. But once looting became widespread, things got violent. There were reports of looters being chased through the streets by a giant pigeon, and several people were even driven insane after merely glancing at the cursed statue. Now, there's no way to know how many of these stories are true, but there's no denying that they paint a terrifying picture of what it would have been like to live in ancient Egypt. The curse of Akhenaten. Akhenaten was one of Egypt's most infamous pharaohs, and it's not for the reasons you might think. Most people know Akhenaten as the husband of Nefertiti and the father of King Tut. However, he was known throughout Egypt for another reason as well. He was an avid supporter of the sun god Aten, which led him to make some controversial decisions. He decided that Aten should be the only god worshipped in Egypt, which led to the destruction of countless other gods and goddesses. In fact, he went so far as to change the entire Egyptian religion around the worship of the sun. But it didn't last long. After his death, the Egyptians returned to their old ways, and Akhenaten was quickly forgotten. Now you might be wondering what this has to do with curses, and the answer might surprise you. After Akhenaten's death, a new pharaoh took the throne, and he made it his mission to erase any evidence of Akhenaten's reign. He destroyed temples, monuments, and anything else that could prove that Akhenaten had ever existed. But some say that he didn't destroy everything. Some say that he left behind a curse. After all, who better to curse someone than someone who's mad that their entire legacy has been erased? Unfortunately, there's no way to tell if this curse is real or not, but that hasn't stopped people from trying to find out. One of the most famous stories comes from the British Museum, where many artifacts from Akhenaten's reign are on display. Some say that anyone who looks directly at the statue of Akhenaten will be cursed by his spirit. Now, if you're an atheist, this probably sounds silly. But when you consider the fact that people used to believe statues were alive and could move on their own, it starts to make a little bit more sense. Still, there's no way to prove that the curse is real, but that hasn't stopped people from trying to find out. For more videos of historical hauntings, stay tuned.